I'm gonna blow your mind a little bit here. I really like Super Smash Bros. However, I think we can all admit that they haven't been flawless over the years by any means. So, quick update. Whenever I put out a new content pull for series-based videos, I need to wait a few days for results to come in and have a bit of room to write some other stuff in the meantime. So a few series entries followed by a more one-off-ish video is probably a good benchmark to expect from the channel. In this case, that means a good old list video, specifically about what I consider to be the least fun, most poorly thought out, or otherwise straight up bad mechanics throughout the history of Smash. Let's do it. Just to clarify, when I say Smash mechanic, I'm specifically referring to a mechanic that's universal within its own game, not character specific. Yes, Brawl Pokemon Trainer's elemental typings were awful. And Brawl Pokemon Trainer's stamina system was awful. And Brawl Pokemon Trainer's inability to switch in the air was awful. But they don't qualify for this video because the systems in place only affected the one character. Beyond that, there isn't really any specific criteria I'm looking at, although it is worth pointing out that this list entirely outlines my personal tastes, and those tend to be more aimed at the pure what were they thinking decisions rather than purely detrimental effects on gameplay. I think some of Melee's ledge mechanics, for example, have caused far more headaches over the years than a lot of the entries featured here, but the initial decisions that led to their implementation are also far easier to defend. With that taken care of, let's just kick things off, starting with... We begin with a mechanic from Smash 4, which thankfully has never left that game. For those who are unaware, teching is the act of tapping your shield button right before you hit a surface in order to avoid crashing haphazardly into it. If you're forced to tech on the ground, this is often a very bad position to find yourself in, since your opponent can continue to apply pressure in a process dubbed tech chasing. But it's still nowhere near as bad as missing your tech, giving your opponent a completely free opening. This is pretty brutal, but should essentially always be avoidable provided your timing is on point. Except in Smash 4. In this game, if you've taken 100 damage or higher, there's a 30% chance that you'll go into a corkscrew animation instead of the usual tumbling one. And guess what? While you're in this animation, you can't tech, no matter how good your timing is. This means that 30% of the time, your ability to survive an attack like this is simply taken away from you, through no fault of your own. I actually like a certain amount of randomness thrown into Smash for spice. I'd never advocate removing Game & Watch's Judge, for example, but this adds nothing to the player or spectator experience, reduces the impact of what should be an important skill in platform fighters, and was so subtle and arbitrary that it took years for people to even realize it was happening. I seriously have no idea why this ever existed, and am very happy that it didn't return for Ultimate. And now we get to Rage, or the knockback of your own attacks scaling up as you take damage. While I certainly don't think Rage was necessary, I don't hate the core idea and understand what they were going for. Although the Smash 4 version, which this segment is more focused on, was not thought through very well at all. Not only was it overtuned, which led to kills that just didn't feel fair by any definition, but it also interacted with multi-hit attacks in bizarre ways that could result in even more ridiculous kills. Ultimate largely fixed both of these, toning down the effects of Rage in general and removing it entirely from multi-hits with this kind of set knockback, making its impact still noticeable but far less egregious. If it was going to stick around, though, I still would have liked to see one more important alteration: the impact that Rage has on combos. This mechanic makes every one of your attacks launch opponents farther. Great for taking earlier stocks, but the opposite of what you want in a combo scenario. This means your own combos become less consistent as Rage builds, which for many characters will result in slower damage output and missed kill confirms, ironically making stocks last longer in some instances, definitely not the intended effect. My solution would just be to put a threshold on when it kicks in, only being applied to attacks that would already send your opponent too far to follow up with. This would still leave the exciting comeback factor while not forcing players to constantly account for it in their combo game, which never seemed like the impact this mechanic was intended to have. Every Smash title since Melee has utilized a second analog stick, and to say that it's had some problems over the years would be an understatement. Admittedly, we may be somewhat stretching the definition of a mechanic here, but I'd say entering a specific input and getting a specific output does just qualify. In which case, the programming behind this has consistently been very poor, sometimes acting as a dedicated input and sometimes just a shortcut for A and the left stick, with an incredibly consistent ability to be the exact opposite of the one you'd want. It's a dedicated input in Melee's single-player modes, where it's used to control the camera. meaning that you can't actually use it for gameplay here, including in the training mode. It gained this function back in later titles, as well as the ability to be assigned inputs other than smash attacks, but this was far from the end of its problems. Trying to assign the stick to tilt attacks in Brawl created a nonsensical mess, resulting in not only tilt attacks, but also jabs and even jumps, depending on how you tried to use it. In Smash 4, on the other hand, you probably wanted to use Tilt Stick, since trying to perform aerials with Smash Stick enabled caused you to lose control of your aerial drift entirely while the stick was being moved. Ultimate introduced a host of its own quirks. To name a few, all I'm hitting here are C-Stick right and jump. The game outputs any buffered short hop aerials done with the C-Stick as neutral airs, despite that clearly not being what I want. And here, you're watching me repeatedly hit the C-Stick. Unless it's returned to a neutral position first, the input gets dropped entirely. This isn't even a comprehensive list of issues the C-Stick has caused over the years, and how we've gone this long without a flawless implementation of what should be a very simple programming task, I honestly don't know. The solution would just be to remove the shortcut entirely, causing the game to always read, for example, C-Stick up as its own input rather than left stick up plus A, and then program how those C-Stick inputs interact with various character states. This wouldn't be trivial to do. Smash does have a reasonable amount of character states to account for, but I just have a Bachelor of Computer Science and could handle this pretty comfortably. It's reasonable to think the programmers hired to develop a major Nintendo IP could do it in their sleep. This really seems more like an example of oversight, or, as much as I hate to say it, laziness. An extremely rare and unfortunate thing to come across in this series. For those who don't know, hit stun is the paralysis your character suffers after being attacked. During this window, your character can't attack back, jump, or air dodge, which is what makes combos possible. The combo game of each Smash title has varied wildly, from Smash 64's inescapable powerhouses, to Melee's interactive extensions, to Smash 4's footstool shenanigans, to Ultimate's generous aerial utility. However, there's one Smash title notorious for its lack of combos: Brawl. Now, contrary to what you might initially believe, Brawl actually has quite a bit of hit stun in theory, the same as Melee, which had a very rich and complex combo game, almost inarguably the most so in the series. However, the crucial difference is that Brawl hard-coded in the ability to cancel this hit stun with specific actions, namely with an air dodge after 13 frames or an attack after 26 frames, which at 60 frames per second isn't a lot of time. This was too long to completely remove combos from the game. Sometimes this hit stun cancel could itself be punished, and it only applied to attacks that sent you tumbling, which is why chain grabs still work, for example, but overall, it still did dramatically alter the combo potential for most of the roster. The intention here was likely to make newcomers feel less frustrated after getting hit, and it certainly gave Brawl its own flavor with a higher emphasis on neutral, but still, it greatly limited characters' options, lowered the pacing and excitement of a match, and didn't seem done in particularly good faith towards the competitive scene, which unfortunately can be said for large chunks of this particular game. Hit stun cancelling still exists in the later titles, but has been toned down significantly, although I'd still like to see it removed entirely. Our honorable mention this time around goes to Meteor Cancelling, or the ability to cancel your momentum with a jump or up special after being hit by a meteor smash, a mechanic which existed in Brawl but was especially prevalent in Melee. I inherently disagree with the concept of this mechanic, but in Melee it was further convoluted by a very small window of launch angles that qualified as meteor smashes, which created an arbitrary second class of attacks that still launched very downwards but couldn't be meteor cancelled, dubbed spikes. Falco's notoriously powerful down air? That's a spike. Marth has one too, but not Mario, or Mewtwo, or Samus, or Donkey Kong. The mechanic disproportionately benefited characters higher on the tier list, which certainly wasn't intentional considering some of these moves were rebalanced in the later PAL release of the game, but was and still is an issue nonetheless. And frankly, even in that version, I think it would have made much more sense to give the other characters spikes instead. Now, again, if I was purely pulling from mechanics based on their impact on gameplay, there are far worse examples I could go with. Move scaling in Brawl was wildly excessive, and so was the lack of landing lag in its air dodges. I could point to the flaws in Ultimate's buffer system, or Smash 64's absurd shield stun. You get the idea. Meteor Cancelling, though, serves no purpose other than to make off-stage interactions less rewarding. A philosophy I think directly opposes the fun of this game genre, and, as evidenced by the existence of moves that can bypass it while only adding to the excitement of a match, was totally unnecessary to begin with. I'm not saying that there's no skill to Meteor Cancelling or that it completely prevents downwards kills, but it really does strike me as a mechanic that should have stayed on the cutting room floor. Considering that it was weakened in Brawl and removed from future titles entirely, it appears the developers agreed. Yes, I know, this is the least original or surprising pick in the history of list videos, but there's a reason for that. Brawl was deliberately designed to be a more approachable and beginner-friendly game after the series creator became worried about Melee's competitive leanings becoming alienating. A thought process you can somewhat understand given that the Smash series was originally created to be a more fun and welcoming offshoot of the fighting game genre, but was being independently developed into one of the most hardcore and technical fighting games of all time. This meant Brawl had better recoveries, slower and less technical gameplay, and weaker offense. And while your personal tastes would impact which games feel you preferred, there was one aspect of Brawl that everyone, whether casual or competitive, new or experienced, all agreed was terrible. Random tripping. Every single time you tried to start running, you had a 1% chance to trip. If you were already running and tried to turn around, it was a 1.25% chance. There was nothing you could do about this outside of walking everywhere. No toggle switch in the options, no advanced techniques to work around it. If you ever wanted to move at full speed, you risked losing total control of your character. This is pretty widely agreed to be one of, if not the biggest missteps in the history of Smash. If the goal was to close the gap between different experience levels, it wasn't impactful enough to do so. Not to mention that the more experienced player would still get more out of these free openings. If the goal was to deliberately sabotage a competitive scene from forming, it didn't work, as evidenced by the tournament footage I've been showcasing throughout this video. It was a horribly annoying and anti-competitive mechanic, sure, but the low odds combined with Brawl's slower characters and weaker punish games meant that it rarely actually dictated the outcome of a match. Which isn't to say it never did, which was not good. However you want to look at random tripping from a design perspective, it failed to accomplish its goals. With all this said, Brawl is certainly the game where tripping is the most notorious, but the mechanic has appeared in every follow-up title as well. Not out of a run, thank God. But many attacks do still have randomized tripping chances when they connect, and while these aren't quite as bad, I still do take issue with them. Look at Kirby, for instance, a character I had to play a fair amount of recently for my signature move tier list video on Inhale. His down tilt will trip the opponent on hit, but only sometimes, with a 30 to 35% chance depending on which part of his foot you connect with. And if you get the trip, you can follow up with anything from a grab to your current copy ability. If you don't get it, however, the follow-ups are non-existent or very small. Tripping itself is a totally reasonable state to have in the game, and I have no issues with moves that do it consistently, but this feels like a very poor use of randomness. Getting a trip off Kirby's down tilt isn't going to make your friends on the couch laugh or cause the crowd to gasp like when Peach pulls a bob-omb. It just means that winning the same neutral interaction sometimes results in a combo, and sometimes doesn't, through no fault of the players. I'd personally redesign these moves entirely so that they always tripped, but for a smaller percentage window. Say Kirby's down tilt tripped up to 45 damage but then stopped. Not only would this remove the feeling of unfairness from the Kirby player and their opponent, depending on whether or not it worked, but it would also make these attacks easier to balance. It would take some time to iron out, like any proposals to change a game's design, but I think it would be healthier in the long run. As of now, though, these issues still exist, and combined with Brawl's colossal missteps, tripping takes my top spot for the single worst mechanic ever seen in the series, which might be my least controversial opinion of all time. Try putting that on your gimmick Twitter account, you little sh. Thanks for watching, everyone, and hey, if you liked it, why not leave a like? Let me know what your list would look like. But before that, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more videos like this, and you can also check me out on Twitter at Mr. MockRock. I stream on Twitch several times per week under MockRock Twitch, and subscribing there gives you access to the MockRock Discord server. You can also do this by becoming a patron or YouTube member, all of which give you other cool stuff, like early and exclusive videos, as well as voting on future content. Later, people. The voters have spoken, and the contender this time around will be Kirby's Inhale. First seen in the character's 1992 debut title Kirby's Dream Land, the Happy Puffball has leaned on the ability ever since during his life of Temple, or Hyrule Temple as many have called it over the years, is one of the most enduring, iconic stage entries in the Super Smash Bros. Series.